Foreign Interference in North America Part 3. Defund the police, sowing hatred among and toward those who are there to protect us. The hysteria surrounding the movement to defund the police is a foreign espionage plot. I do enjoy a great opening line. For the most part, the attempt to defund police departments across the Western world came up short. However, the integrity of police associations is being tested constantly. As well, new plans are being hatched up to figure out a way to finally get the police to be defunded in the Western world. Yes, we can say the radical left agenda blah blah blah. Remember, however, just how the radical right is being manipulated by outside forces, China, Russia, Iran. The radical left is being manipulated as well by those same forces. But I've said all this already. I believe in a long-winded way I've also explained how and why. Perhaps I'll reiterate in summary. By putting a strain in the relationship between law enforcement and the public, is an attempt to destabilize society. The police are there to help us. However, elements of those on the left express fear and extreme hatred toward them. In contrast, the center-right seems to side with local law enforcement. Conversely, there is a new movement that attacks federal law enforcement. Except the attacks on the CIA and FBI and the like are being expressed from the far-right side of the aisle. A loud fringe minority on the right. For now, I haven't noticed any hatred for CSIS or RCMP. Perhaps it's a matter of time if nothing is done about it. Social media posts and comments stoke hatred toward law enforcement. At first it was toward local police, but now it's also toward federal police. Whatever side of the political spectrum hates which type of police doesn't matter. The point of the sowing of hatred is to cause division between people. As well, it's to grow mistrust of those sworn to protect us. It's to destabilize society. If we're not careful, it will work. Then we will be subjects of a new empire we didn't sign up for. Moreover, whether or not the defunding of whatever form of police happens, an additional goal is to pit society against each other. It's working. But I do notice once an issue is resolved, there is a new one that springs up. It's a campaign that ebbs and flows to the form that works best at any given moment. It works best in times of crisis. Some of the crises are manufactured, some are coincidental. They're all taken advantage of. Canada is particularly vulnerable. Not only has China been found to have meddled in our 2019 and 2021 federal elections, apparently in favor of Trudeau. In June 2023, it is alleged, a political assassination was executed on Canadian soil by the Indian government, toward a Sikh cultural leader. Whether or not that is true, it degrades confidence the public has toward their top of law enforcement. I could myself be a target for expressing my views. Russian or Chinese agents, who are roaming about doing whatever task may be tasked to kill me for what I write. It seems there's nothing the RCMP or CSIS can do about it. Perhaps that's the idea with that killing. Anyone who may have an opinion against a foreign actor now is at risk. Perhaps public expressions of support to Ukraine will diminish, if civilians are being killed for their beliefs where it was supposed to be safe to do so. Another example of Canadian vulnerability is the Nazi war veteran who received a standing ovation in Parliament in September 2023, during a visit by Volodymyr Zelensky. That's deeply embarrassing. Now, memorabilia across Canada, commemorating Ukraine's fight for survival in the 20th century, are being considered for demolition or removal. Of course, no one should commemorate extermination. Yes, Ukraine has a checkered past, as does every country on Earth. Today, however, the leadership of Ukraine is not the leadership of a Nazi army. It's that of a country trying desperately to cling to sovereignty. Anyhow, how does that fiasco in Canadian Parliament show vulnerability in Canada? It shows the public and the world that the leadership in Canada is brain dead. The Conservatives came running to drive that point home. I will not be surprised if the Trudeau government dissolves within a year. I will also not be surprised if the Liberals aren't elected for the next 10 years. That leaves the Conservatives, who are supposed to be fiscally responsible, the runners-up. However, this Conservative government is not showing signs of fiscal aptitude when it comes to the Bank of Canada. As well, I don't have high hopes that the Conservatives in Canada will show resolute support for Ukraine and NATO. One good thing that might be, is there will be less support for defunding police departments. The importance of an independent central bank. I've explained previously the need for a central bank. I detailed its purpose and the mechanisms a central bank uses to maintain a functional economy. I touched on quickly the importance that prominent figures shouldn't criticize what the Federal Reserve does. Especially so if they have no idea how it works. I'm going to take the time in this segment to drive that point home. Perhaps I'm too young to remember the last time the central bank rose interest rates. Or perhaps I'm just a late bloomer. It's only been around 2 years since I really began understanding the ins and outs of a capitalist economy. I'm sure there's a lot I have to learn. Not just in deeper understanding of the mechanisms used to keep our economy healthy, but also an understanding that dissenting voices may not mean the central banks are in jeopardy. I looked back to 2007 when interest rates were rising before the financial crisis. Bernie Sanders was lambasting the central bank chair for their decision to raise rates. America didn't crumble, it came back stronger, as it did the previous time. Perhaps I shouldn't care what dissenting voices say. It's all hot air, the Fed will carry on. I hope. Perhaps if I watched the Republican and Democratic primary debates of the 2008 election cycle, I would find a handful of candidates who would rein in or reform the Federal Reserve, just like 2 Republican primary candidates had said just recently. That would be evidence that Vivek Ramaswamy will be a plastic bag floating in the wind, never to be seen or heard from again, and the Fed will carry on. I hope my fears are just naivete. That said, I'm really worried about Canadian politics. There is pressure from China and Russia to oust Trudeau. If you're up to date, it's said that China favors the Liberals, but I came to another conclusion. During the 2021 elections, she expressed favor for the Liberals. This is true. However, the vast majority of Canadians, Liberals, and Conservative, view the CCP negatively. I believe that Xi's expression of favor was to in fact undermine the Liberals. If not for the blatant interference, there may have been a landslide for the Liberals. The current federal Conservatives have their issues. There is a lot of Chinese and Russian espionage talking points written into their rhetoric and interests. I must say all of the parties are somewhat compromised. In my opinions, the Liberals are least so, for now. For the Conservatives, they favor crypto, all of which at the time of this writing is under question, criminal or otherwise. What concerns me most in this time of economic turmoil is the Conservative leadership has attacked the Bank of Canada. So far, the Liberals have not. If the Liberals want a bathroom for every gender that comes about, that isn't as bad as runaway inflation. Runaway inflation is the worst thing that can possibly happen. Who cares what bathroom someone uses when you can't afford bread or milk, much less rent? The central bank is apolitical. It's there to maintain price stability. Cryptocurrencies, and tampering with the inner working of the Fed by people who haven't the foggiest how it works against price stability. Of course, there is pain, but fiscal tightening by way of interest rate hikes and interest rate decreases is the way to maintain price stability across the board. Perhaps there should be a more concerted effort to inform the public. Perhaps the public is already more informed than I'm aware. There is evidence of the contrary, however. Perhaps it's the schooling, or perhaps the rampant espionage pumping through our social media and news media could make people unlearn how the economy works. If I ever come to power, I will advocate for mandatory economic education for K through 12. Anyhow, the reason I'm concerned is because I'm fearful that the interference is ramping up in Canada. Perhaps it'll blow over, but this Nazi in Parliament business could really be a wrench in the Liberal Party engine. Who knows what could be around the corner? As long as the current leadership maintains their dangerous rhetoric, a Conservative or NDP leadership right now would be disastrous. Perhaps it's just smoke and mirrors. Perhaps once any leader comes to power, they tone down their goals. After all, inflation came down from 9% to 4%. What sucks is that final 2% looks like it's going to hurt. This could hurt the Liberal chances for re-election in 2025. I'm worried that perhaps an NDP or Conservative leader will win by default and play into China and Russia's hands. Hopefully we will have cleared the fence by then. Maybe the opposition leaders would have smartened up too, then I might not have to worry too much. Let me get back to why the central bank needs to be independent. Its goal is to make sure no matter who you voted for, you have a job. Its goal is to make sure you can afford rent and groceries. The Fed doesn't care where you live, it doesn't care what you eat, it doesn't care which podcast subscriptions you pay for. It cares that you are able to pay for the things you want. Why does it care about you? It's because if the citizens don't have a good job, or can't pay their way through life, GDP doesn't grow. As well, if the head of the central bank fails at their job, they'll be fired. Who wants to be fired? It's in their best interest to make sure price stability is maintained. What constitutes central bank failure? It isn't 9% inflation, it's 100% inflation. How can we help make sure the central bank does its job properly? By getting a good job. What does that mean? A job that is in demand. If your job pays little, and business is slow, which means you get few hours weekly, that's a sign of a bad job. At one point you'll be laid off. If your job pays little but leaves you extremely busy, perhaps there is room for your personal growth. Perhaps you'll get a promotion. The central bank always wants jobs in the economy that gets people busy. Being busy means people are creating and serving other people what they need. This grows the economy, which is good for GDP statistics. If you find yourself somewhere that keeps you busy, serving or creating, instead of busy, standing, and waiting for something to happen, you'll be better off when it comes time for the central banks to test the economy. Remember, businesses that are doing poorly add to inflation. Interest rate hikes are meant to weed out poorly run businesses, to make way for better run businesses. Democracies of the Western world seem to know of the subversive elements attempting to ingrain society. There was a damning report released in September 2023 by the United States State Department detailing the sort of espionage tactics CCP undergoes across the globe. Does that sound familiar? There was also another report on Russia's tactics in espionage. The latter one came out in August 2020. And it's just as damning. However, it's also nerve-settling. One of the reasons I'm writing this book is because I thought I was alone in what I have been noticing on the internet and in the real-world spaces. Both those reports express exactly what I have mentioned previously in this piece of work. However, I was hesitant to suggest what I noticed was by any part done by the CCP. This China report changes that. All the effort I had suggested Russia was doing in terms of subversion and sabotage is apparently also being done by China. Even though I guess that's not particularly good news. To me it comes as a wave of relief to know that the US and its allies know well enough what the foreign adversaries are doing, and to what degree. It also answers some questions I've had. I was almost sure the intelligence services of the Western Alliance knew about all these subversive tactics. As I assumed they knew, I was wondering why they didn't call them out. It seemed they were just putting band-aids on the problem by changing one thing in a system that seemed to have been compromised. Of course, I'm not entirely sure, but it does seem to me that the Western nations are using their democratic institutions to try and negate the effects of subversion by changing certain aspects as needed. Yes, a foreign adversary may try something, but once found out, it'll be changed or rearranged so that problem may never happen again. Over time it may become harder for adversaries to either infiltrate or subvert democratic processes. I know that's a vague example. Let me try with one a little more specific. There is an attempt to divide the Western world by race. The goal is dismantling of society. The wedge that's constantly pressed on in the US is the relationship between white and black people. The attempt to address this is by appointing black people into positions of leadership and power. There are hard right voices saying what they say. Remember, they're being manipulated by espionage artists. As well, those with the loudest voices are themselves espionage artists, most definitely. Regardless of hate speech and conspiracy theories, I believe the effort made to express to the black diaspora that they are included and loved, that they have a place in civilian leadership is understood broadly. They aren't the other. Although the system of diversity allocation isn't perfect, without it, there would be a chasm for bad actors to exploit. And they try desperately to exploit anything they can. What I've noticed is, if there is a problem that's being overblown, that has been documented to be espionage, the lawmakers, instead of calling it out, decide to change something in law or other. This is to weed out the problem so it will cease or diminish. Maybe it will work. Perhaps in time it will. However, if an adversary is quick, they may break through and achieve their goal. Or perhaps if the adversary is excessively slow and subtle but persistent, it may leave us blind until it's too late for us to repair the damage. The Nazi in Parliament in Canada rings of a bit of doom on the horizon. The attack on Israel in October 2023 also rings of doom. There are encroaching threats that may be slowly killing us or dismantling us. Fentanyl, prescription drugs US vs Canada. There's an interesting debate about prescription drugs and healthcare in general in the United States. It's a major issue in the media at least. There is a lot of judgment made upon the US for how their healthcare isn't universal, which is to mean free. At first glance it does look like that. A citizen in the United States doesn't automatically have health insurance like one would in Canada or in Europe. An American has to sign up for health insurance to receive those benefits of subsidy for doctor visits and prescriptions. In the United States, one can on their own sign up for an insurance of their choice, but most Americans get their insurance from their employer. This is similar to how Canadians get optical and dental care paid by their employer. I've broken down in an earlier part of this book the probabilities of who exactly may or may not have health care in the USA, and why. I'll quickly summarize. The homeless sadly of course by default don't have insurance because they're also jobless. The temporarily unemployed, those in between jobs probably don't have health insurance either. As well, migrant workers without any sort of documents of course couldn't if they wanted to. Finally, the rich don't have insurance because they can foot the bill if they need to. That's only roughly 30 million people, out of a population of 332 million. That's 9% of the people in the USA. Most of the people without insurance made the choice for whatever reason to go without. Anyhow, the reason I bring this up is because of the deaths from fentanyl and prescription drugs. Teens and adults ingest fentanyl without knowing. Of course, these prescription drugs weren't bought at a Walgreens or CVS. They were bought in the black market from dealers who sell counterfeits. People who want to buy knockoff Adderall or painkillers find themselves dead. Not because they were trying to get high, but because they wanted to concentrate better in school, or because they had a workplace injury that needed relief. There's an argument that suggests if healthcare in the United States were affordable, these deaths might not have happened. That's pretty compelling. However, just because you have insurance doesn't mean you'll get the drug you want because you asked your doctor nicely. As well, certain segments of the population cannot have health insurance because they're undocumented. In these two cases one may opt for the black market. One by choice going against their doctor's recommendations, and one by necessity because they're off the books and don't want to be deported. These two situations were always going to happen is what I'm trying to say. Another thing I'm trying to say is, not only is fentanyl being cut into drugs they have no purpose in, there is misinformation and disinformation being spread on the topic. What I just explained needs to be expressed loud and clear, by the media, and governments. This is a multifold problem. People are dying from drugs they had no idea they were ingesting. As well, hatred toward the US government is being fomented, not just by its citizens, but by other nations' citizens. This could destabilize joint efforts between governments and between citizens. Of course, it should be obvious what hatred toward a government by its citizens could lead to. As well, another issue that hasn't been mentioned yet, the migrants who have no healthcare but need it. They're here working for cash, possibly below minimum wage because it's better than being where they came from. Whether the status quo is maintained or amnesty for settled migrants is undergone, it needs to be addressed. Not enough is being mentioned on that front.